So again, inside your own head, begin to say to yourself, is there anything in there I'd like to change? Would I like to be fearless? Don't worry. Fearless doesn't mean stupid. Fearless doesn't mean imprudent. I'm not afraid of trucks, but I don't stand in front of them to prove it. Anything that fear can do, knowledge and skill can do better. But again, we've had this rationalization. Well, I got to have some fears. You got to put fears into people, or your life won't work. I don't believe that. We rationalize all the time. We lie to ourselves. That's what I call a rationalization, a lie to self. Why? Oh, to protect our easily damaged, easily bruised ego. It wasn't me, it was the world. It was the establishment, it was the red tape, it was that difficult, impossible, immoral, egomaniacal person I deal with. Oh, that feels better. Reduces my effectiveness, excuses me from being effective, excuses me from trying to influence that person. That's another automatic program in our brain, rationalization. It's a belief program. And I think Ph.D.s have it to the ultimate. I mean, you've all heard the descriptions, haven't you? We know what a BS is. Okay, an MS is more of the same, and a Ph.D. is piled higher and deeper. I mean, I swear, we all get Ph.D.s in rationalization because academics can rationalize, out-rationalize, meta-rationalize anybody on the face of the earth. We are so good at lying to ourselves. So, I hope that has whetted your appetite for an approach. And there are many approaches out there. There's a lot of good stuff out there. I've looked at many of the approaches, certainly not all of them. And I've seen one that, at least for me, has kind of resonated with the way in which I deal with the world. And it's the one I'm going to share with you. But part of what I want you to see as we go through this approach is that maybe it's not the one for you. There are a lot of different ways out there based on the same basic research about how the brain works, but slightly different ways of going inside to your head and producing override programs. If you use this or you use one of the other methods based on the same research about the brain, you can, in fact, over a relatively short period of time, and by the way, the tool I'm going to show you, the technique, is quick, efficient, painless, and completely safe. Sounds like magic, eh? But it is. At the same time, there's going to be a deep-rooted resistance in you to going out and applying it. You're going to have all kinds of reasons not to use it. Oh, that sounds good, but it's not for me. I'm going to get to that as soon as I have a chance, as soon as my desk is cleared. That's 4 years after you retire. Those little games, again, the mechanisms in our head are incredibly subtle and incredibly powerful. Because there's a bottom line here. And to most of us, at some level, perhaps subconsciously, it's a frightening bottom line. Once you embark on the process of self-design, something becomes absolutely, compellingly clear to you. You must, forever after, take 100% of the responsibility for what you think, how you feel, and how you act. And we have been taught since we were about 3 years old, at all costs, don't do that. Scapegoat it. Rationalize it. Deny it. The old philosopher said, know thyself. Socrates put it far more cleverly. He said, the unexamined life is not worth living. That's an incredibly complex, sophisticated comment. You see, he didn't say the examined life was worth living. He merely noted that the unexamined life wasn't worth living. Well, I'll tell you, until we've discovered this about the brain, until we now have this safe, efficient, painless, effective technique for altering what goes on in our heads, until we had that, it may not have been a good idea to examine your life. Why? What would you discover as you introspected and looked at yourself? What would you find in there?
Certain things didn't work.
Certain things didn't work. Would you find certain things you didn't like about yourself? Again, some of those arbitrary garbage reactions put into you without your permission? Yeah. What's the point of looking at that stuff if you can't change it? I mean, know thyself sounds like a very depressing prospect for most of us. But now the examined life is worth living. Why? Because once you examine it and you decide how you want to think and how you want to feel and how you want to behave, how you want to react to external and internal stimuli, and you start this process of designing yourself, it is worth living. And you're not scapegoating everybody else out there in the world, and you're not scapegoating the society, and you're not scapegoating the government, and you're not scapegoating your spouse or your boss or your company or the economy.
Or your mother.
Or your mother. Very good.
Sorry.
You understand that you have the power within you to alter who you are. Now, there are a couple of implications I want to warn you about, and then we'll get into the model itself. Once you get into this, you begin to see its power. You begin to see its literal power. You don't have to be afraid if you don't want to. You don't have to be angry. You don't have to lose your temper. You don't have to think thoughts you don't want to think. You don't have to engage in behaviors that you regret. It will inevitably change your patterns of behavior. You're in a social context, aren't you? A social milieu. Do you have any idea what happens when you begin to change the patterns of your behavior? The people around you get very upset. Some of them, not all of them. Even if it's to their benefit, it's a change. Why? Continuity's been destroyed. Consistency is no longer there. They used to be able to push a button and get Don to do this, and they push the button and Don doesn't do that anymore, and that is threatening. So folks start to move around you in different ways. You have broken the choreography of your relationships with other people. And new ones have to be established, and that can be painful for them and possibly a little painful for you. You're also going to be a little scary to some folk. It's scary when you know you've got fears and the people you're dealing with or the person you're dealing with doesn't seem to. That's very unnerving for some folks. I have changed significant patterns of my behavior. One of the things, and again, it has a cost to it, and you better know what the costs are. I mean, there's systemic implications in a social system when one of the members makes radical changes in behavior. And if you change how you think and how you feel, you're going to make some changes in how you behave. For example, I won't let people rationalize for me anymore. That's one of the things friends do for friends. Say, Bruce, hey, nobody could deal with him. Don't feel the pain of that failure. He is an SOB cubed, and we all know it. And Bruce is supposed to feel better now. You come to me and say, hey, Chuck, hey, that's it. I mean, you know what that dean's like. I say, wait a minute, no. Don't get me off the hook. Sure, I have failures, but if I don't take responsibility for those failures, then I don't go back and become more effective. And people get annoyed when I won't accept their kind gesture of rationalizing for me. Worse yet, and they've all learned this at the university, I won't rationalize for them. And so they don't come to me anymore with their sorrows and with their burdens and with their failures open. I'll say, hey, that's okay. Don't worry about it, Ann. It's not you, it's the system. You change your relationships with people. And that's a jarring experience for them and somewhat for you. There's a period of adjustment one has to go through. But I will say to you, certainly personally and anecdotally with respect to lots of people with whom I've shared this method, technique, approach, once you start moving on it, you never stop. Because you understand that you now control the quality of your life. That indeed, your total life takes place between your ears, and you have ultimate control over what happens inside your head between your ears, barring chemical and neurological damage. So, I hope I have your attention now and some motivation and enthusiasm for this technique, because I'm going to show you what I think, for me at least, has been the most powerful approach to self-design. Because it's not easy. We do have to overcome a whole series of rationalizations, well-entrenched socializations and culturations about things inside of ourselves we may not like, but we excuse them, we justify them. And the reason for that sort of lengthy introduction is precisely because if we don't have a high motivation for change, that fear of taking responsibility, our own fear of change, the strangeness of this idea begins to push it back into the recesses of our brain, and we come up with all kinds of reasons for not trying this. Now, the tool I will be sharing with you, I learned from a psychiatrist. His name is Maxie C. Maltzby, Jr., M.D. And I'd looked at lots of things in the self-help literature. I'd looked at lots of the programming coming out of neurolinguistic programming. I'd looked at some of the things coming out of the work of Aaron Beck, and indeed Maltzby was Aaron Beck's first or early graduate student. And as I said, this isn't the only way to do it. There's some very, very good approaches out there, and perhaps you have to find the one that matches you and your personality and how you feel comfortable in looking at yourself and attempting to create these override programs. But Maltzby, in an early book I read of his called Rational Behavior Therapy, and by the way, most of the good stuff that I know of has come out of psychiatry and clinical psychology, because those people are professionally interested in dysfunctional programs in people's heads, and they're the ones who are trying to find methods and techniques that help people deal with negative emotions, phobias, irrational fears, etc., etc. So I read the book, and then I went and talked with him, and he gave me more materials and showed me some of the 27 years of cohort studies he has about people whom he has shared this with and how they responded, and I just got more and more interested. I use language somewhat different from Maltzby's because I'm looking for ways to communicate it in ways that I think are particularly effective for the audiences I deal with. So we're not to hold Maltzby responsible for my language nor for any miscues I may give about his approach, but I'm certainly indebted to him. And as you look at this, and if you want to pursue it further, this is one of the places that you can go. Again, what's interesting about this process is he came up with it well before the research on the brain was available, and yet his way of thinking about this maps so beautifully on the current understanding we have on the structure of the brain that it's quite amazing, and therefore he's gotten some kind of post hoc validation of his thoughts because he came up with them without that literature, and now the literature just resonates to this approach. But again, Maltzby would say, yes, we have all this stuff in our head. We didn't put it there. It was put in there without our permission. But there is a way to override anything in your brain. Now keep that word very much at the forefront of your thinking. We're not going to talk about deprogramming. We're not going to talk about reprogramming. We're not going to talk about erasing programs from your brain. Most, if not all, programs that go into your brain either by hardwiring or repetition, learning through repetition, are going to be there for the rest of your life. And that's important to know because any program that you decide to label as dysfunctional or counterproductive is still resting in the neurological potentialities of your brain. And as we'll see later, there are certain conditions under which that program may occasionally replay, and you shouldn't be worried about that or concerned about it. But one of the things that Maltzby has is a little cartoon, series of cartoons, storyboards that tell us how we get our emotional responses. And it's simple, but it's rather clever. And he tells us the first thing we have to do is identify something, some response, some either emotion or action that we engage that we would rather not feel as an emotion, a behavior or action we would rather not engage. He then says you have to create the new program and finally install the new program. And he illustrates a significant part of this in this little cartoon strip that he uses. He shows three people, and they look very much the same. He shows their heads in profile. The first two are identical. The third one is a little different, a little heavier. And he shows them looking at a cake. And he says, the cake is just a neutral stimulus out there in the world. But as soon as each of these people, A, B, and C, see the cake, those data fragments will whirl around in their brains and they will make some sense of the cake. And he says the first person sees the cake and says, I think that's a delicious cake. I've seen cakes like that before. The second person says, hey, as I walked in the room and saw that cake, I think some flies were on it and they flew off. I think that's a disease-ridden, germ-ridden cake. And the third person sees the cake and says, boy, that looks like a delicious cake, but I'm trying to lose some weight. So I really shouldn't eat that cake. Those are the beliefs, and part of what Maltzby is going to talk to us about is stimuli hit us from the external world and internal. He calls them activating events. And our brain makes sense of them. It's not that we consciously and deliberately choose to make a certain sense of them. They go in, and based on a huge complex set of past experiences and assumptions and beliefs, we interpret the data. Again, those translation boxes I was talking about earlier. He said if you believe certain things about the activating event or the stimuli, then you're likely to feel things, have emotions that are compatible with your thoughts. So what would be the appropriate emotion for character A who looks at the cake and says, that's a delicious cake? How are they likely to feel about the cake? Positive. Positive feelings. Maybe start salivating, eh? Person B, what will be the appropriate feelings about the cake for person B who believes that there were flies with germs on the cake just before he walked in the room and saw it?
Dislike.
Negative feelings. Disgust. The third person sees it as a delicious cake, but also sees it as a source of additional calories. Now, if this person hasn't been through this process, then they're conflicted. They believe one thing but feel another. See, I'd really like it, but I shouldn't. But fortunately for us and for Maltzby, the C person has been through this and has said, hey, I feel neutral, calm, indifferent toward the cake. Okay? Because that's how I have installed a new program, a calmness, neutrality feeling inside myself about the cake. Then Maltzby says, okay, if you think certain thoughts and have certain feelings that are consistent with those thoughts, chances are very good, not inevitable, but chances are very good that you're going to engage in some behavior that is consistent with how you think and how you feel. Now, all things being equal, assuming the person A isn't full and they don't think the cake is being saved for some special event, what behavior might they quite naturally engage in?
Eating.
Eat it. Person B?
Not eating.
Walk away from it, possibly throw it out. Person C, walk away with feelings of calmness or cut a slice for others and serve it to them, but not take any cake himself. What Maltzby's pointing out in this little cartoon, and it's really very helpful, is that again, what we think and how we feel and how we behave is pretty arbitrary. It doesn't mean it's capricious, but it's arbitrary. It could be otherwise. And it's a function of these pre-existing programs, these receptors, these processors in our brains. And if you either have a feeling you don't want to have, anger or remorse or insecurity or fear, or if you engage in a behavior you'd rather not engage in, what you have to really do is go back into your brain, see what that activating event is that triggers either the feelings you don't want or the behavior you don't want to engage in, and build a new program. A new program of beliefs. Because he calls it rational behavior therapy, he thinks for the most part beliefs drive emotions and beliefs and emotions drive behaviors. There's some counter evidence of an interesting sort to that assumption, but for the most part I think he's on target. What you'll see here in a moment is Maxime Maltzby's way of building an alternative program. And by the way, you'll note, not surprisingly, he's a psychiatrist, it is a very left brain analytical process. What's amazing about Maltzby is when he gets to the point of installation, he somehow intuited that installing the new program in your head requires more than talking to yourself, requires more than laying it out in a certain way. So let's begin to look at this sample self-design worksheet. What Maltzby says is, look, take a piece of paper, and on the left side of the piece of paper, draw a line down the middle, and you've got two large columns now. And on the left side of it, you're going to have the current situation, the current, what I will call programming. Maxby doesn't use programming language. I think it's a useful one. He says you start over there at number 1, and you describe the activating event, the stimuli, the stimulus. So let me give you an example. I'm going to go through this with a fairly commonsensical example that most of you can probably identify with. Supposing I have a good friend. We get along, we share a lot together, and we're both very heavily into jazz. We really like jazz music, and we share tapes and records and CDs. We go to jazz concerts together. We talk about jazz artists, etc., etc. That's part of my background, part of my life, part of his. But my friend has an annoying habit. Now, the first thing you should do is chide me for my use of language, right? What did I just say?
You said your friend has an annoying.
My friend, it doesn't annoy him in the least. Again, do you see how easy it is to fall into the trap? My friend has an annoying habit. No. My friend has a habit, behavior, and when I pick it up and see it, it hits my arbitrary translation box and I feel annoyance. That's the truth of it.
And you want us to agree with you.
Thank you, and rationalize and reinforce and all. Very good, very good. Well, what is this habit that my friend has that pushes my annoyance button? He's always late. He's probably one of those right brain people. Never any sense of time. What's the activating event? Because I'm always on time, huh? The activating event is I get 2 tickets to the greatest jazz concert of the decade. And I let him know well in advance, and he's as excited as can be. I said, look, it's on a Sunday afternoon. Here's the date. I want you at my house at 2 o'clock. Concert starts at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And you know you're always late. Do you promise to be on time? My friend promises, huh? Cross his heart. The Sunday of the jazz concert comes. I'm all set, 2 o'clock, sitting in my living room, all ready to go, keys, I'm all organized. Look at my watch, 2 o'clock. I knew it. It's not here. 2:10, 2:20, 2:30, 2:35, he starts sauntering up my walk. That's an activating event. So Maltzby says, describe the activating event, and then, at number 2, try and list as realistically as you can the beliefs that would be charging up out of your subconsciousness into your consciousness between 2 and 2:35. Now, what kinds of things am I going to be saying to myself about this situation between 2 and 2:35? Have any idea what my beliefs are?
I can't believe I trusted him.
Can't believe I trusted him. I knew he was going to be late. He's doing it deliberately. I sometimes question our friendship. I have a right to be angry. Wait till he gets here and what I'm going to give him. Those might be some of your sincere beliefs. What emotions am I likely to be experiencing in the face of those beliefs about this situation? Anger, alienation, disappointment, frustration, possibly fear. So I've laid out the beliefs I have about this situation. At number 3, I've laid out the emotions I'm likely to experience in that situation. And at number 4, if it is appropriate, I lay out the behavior I'm likely to engage in. As I open the door and my friend comes through, any sense of the behavior I might take? Vent the old frustration. Chew him out, give him what for, let him know he let me down again. Description of the behavior. That's the current situation. That's in the left-hand column. And you're going to use that to create the new, again, I will call it program. Because those are the components. There's a stimulus out there in the world. It activates beliefs on the left side of the brain, emotions on the right side of the brain, and then a combination of left and right into behavior, because our behavior is very much a function of both. Now watch the sequence here, because it's a little different. You now come over to the other side, and remember, you chose this activating event because it frequently or always generates either an emotion you don't want to have or a behavior you don't want to engage in. So Maltzby says, next thing you do, number 5, is write out what behavior you do want to engage in. Now, do you see why I set this up earlier? If you don't want to engage in the chewing out, venting frustration, behavior, then what behavior do you want to engage in? Do you want to be calm and neutral? And say, hey, how you doing? Or do you want to say, hey, let's get going now? And lead your friend to the car, and get in the car and start the concert. Indeed, what's happening while I'm chewing my friend out and venting my frustrations? I'm going even later to the concert, aren't I? That's curious. We will come back to that. At number 6, Maltzby says, if you don't want to feel anger and frustration and disappointment and alienation, what do you want to feel? And this is where it starts to rub us. Well, I have a right to be angry. Yeah, but you said you didn't want to be angry. So do you want to be thoughtful? Do you want to be compassionate? Do you want to be empathetic? What do you want to be? If you don't want to be angry and frustrated and alien, what do you want to feel? And do you see how important it is to create the emotions you do want, because they're the ones you have to practice, so that when that happens again, if it happens again, you can send it to the calmness or the empathetic or whatever response. You decide how you want to feel. If you don't want to feel that way, then how? Well, I don't want to feel angry. Well, what do you want to feel then? Not anger is not an emotion. So now you've begun to describe two parts of the new program. The behaviors you want to engage in if this should happen again, and the emotions you want to experience when this happens again. Then Maltzby says, hey, jump up to the activating event and do what he calls the camera check. This is step number 7. Now, what does he mean by that? What he means is, and what he's found is, that oftentimes when people describe the activating event, they already have a series of conclusions in it. Okay? The emotions are already starting to erupt in the description. For example, when I described my friend, how did I describe him coming up the walk? Sauntering. He wasn't sauntering, he was walking. And the reason Maltzby calls it a camera check is he says, describe whatever you had at number 1 as a camera would see it. Without interpretation, without attribution of motivation, without coloring it in an editorial way. What would a camera see? The camera would see, I'm looking at my watch says 2:35, and my friend is walking up the walk. So he wants you to neutralize, to sanitize, to take any conclusions that you've already reached in your belief statements out of that activating event. It's very much like the cake. Is it a delicious cake? Is it a germ-laden cake? It isn't anything until you put interpretation on it. So he wants the neutral description of the activating event, or the stimulus as I would call it. So, here's the self-designed program so far. A camera check, sort of sanitized, neutralized description of the activating event. The emotions I want to feel, the behaviors I want to engage in. Now becomes the most interesting part. The only thing we haven't done anything with yet is the set of sincere beliefs, as he calls them, at step 2. He said the key to this whole thing is to take a look at those beliefs, because it is those beliefs that are triggering the negative emotions and triggering the negative behavior. So you have to take a look at those, quote, current beliefs and subject them to 5 criteria. And he's developed these, again, over 25 years of practice and trying to come up with the best possible model for people to install override programs. Criterion 1 is my behavior and is my belief based on fact. So he doesn't want fantasy out there. Does my behavior/belief help me protect my life and health? Does my behavior and belief help me achieve my goals now and in the future? And does my behavior belief help me avoid unwanted conflict with others? Finally, he says, does my behavior belief help me feel the way I want to? So those are his 5 criteria for rational beliefs. And he says, take those, again, this is very left brain up till now, isn't it? Very analytical kind of thing. He says, take those 5 criteria and apply them to the sincere beliefs at step 2 in your current program. And what do you suppose his contention is when you start to apply those criteria to those things you believe? They're not going to meet the criteria. And he says, if a belief cannot meet at least 3 of the 5 criteria, it must be abandoned. It cannot be brought over to the new beliefs that you're going to have triggered in you when that event occurs. And the contention is pretty obvious. If something meets those criteria, it isn't going to generate the conflicts, the negative emotions, etc., the behavior that you're engaging in. So let's take a few of the ones I gave you a few moments ago. My friend was late on purpose. Is that based on fact? It's an assumption. In fact, he may have had a very good reason for being late this time, but often his lateness is not on purpose. Does it help me achieve my objectives? To believe that? Does it help me protect my health? Does it help me stay out of unwanted conflicts? No, it gets me into unwanted conflicts. Does it help me behave the way I want to behave? No, it gets me to behave ways I don't want to behave. Now, a lot of people when they hit this say, wait a minute, aren't you rationalizing? Wait a minute. Remember, Maltzby says it has to be based on fact. And what we all know, if we think about it for a moment, any event in the world could trigger virtually any belief in your head at all, couldn't it? I mean, you could just sort of arbitrarily, and some of the weird things people seem to have triggered in their heads by an event out there in the world are testimony to that. Of all those beliefs that could be triggered by an event, a small sample, a small set of them are true or based on truth. of the ones that are true or factual, some of them make you feel ways you don't want to feel. And some of them can make you feel ways you do want to feel. But he really is always late. Yeah, well, we'll get to that one in just a moment. What Maltzby is saying is there are some truthful or factual-based beliefs about your friend showing up late that in fact will lead you to feel the way you want to feel and to behave the way you want to behave. We're going to show you what those are in just a moment. But things like, he did it on purpose, I have a right to be angry, those aren't getting me anywhere. Even if you do have a right to be angry, it isn't satisfying the other four criteria. So what I discover when I do this about my friend is there's only one belief that meets at least 3 of the 5 criteria. And that belief is, my friend's always late. That's true. It's based on fact, based on a huge track record. Could that belief operate to help me preserve my, my health and life? Yeah, it could. I mean, it's a bitter cold day. My friend says he'll meet me at the corner at 2 o'clock. I know he's not going to be there at 2. I'm not going to stand out in that corner because I know he won't be there. I'll peek out at 2:15 and maybe he'll be there. So that belief could meet that criterion. It's based on fact. It could meet the criterion. It could help me achieve my objectives if I use it right. It could help me feel the way I want to feel if I use it right. It could help me stay out of unwanted conflicts if I use it right. So that one goes over there. And now what do I have on that second column under the belief area? The rational belief area. I have this single statement staring at me. My friend is always late. Now what's Maxie say we have to do? You got to build some more rational beliefs on that right side, and none of the rest of them on the left are going to make it over, so you've got to come up with some new beliefs based on fact about this situation that'll help you feel the way you want to feel and do what you want to do. And you've already indicated what you want to feel and what you want to do. This statement's sort of, confronting me. My friend's always late. My friend's always late. Did I know that? Is there anything I could have done, knowing my friend is always late, to have prevented this situation from coming about? E.g., what could I have done?
Ask him to come at 1.
Ask him to come at 1. Doctors frequently have patients who are chronically late, and they just say, oh, come at 3, and put 3:30 in the book, and everybody's happy. Because the person, I don't know if you've noticed or not, but people who are chronically late are almost always precisely chronically late. I mean, in a fundamental way, they have to have a better sense of time than the rest of us because they can shape. Well, they're always 12 minutes late. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. I could have asked that person to come at 1 instead of 2. What else could I have done?
You could have given him the ticket in advance and had him meet you there.
Tell him to meet me there knowing he's late. Then I'm there on time and he pays the price for his lateness by missing part of the concert. Anything else I could have done? Well, let the imagination go. I could have picked him up, thereby more likely controlling the departure time. I could have taken his ticket and put it in an envelope and glued it on the front of the door and said, hey, I'm on my way, please meet me down there. I had all sorts of alternatives available to me, knowing my friend is always late. I didn't exercise any of them. I wonder why. Now, one of the new beliefs I put up there is I had several alternatives, and I have several alternatives in the future for dealing with my friend's chronic lateness. Bing, bing, bing. Here are my alternatives. Now, I said to myself, why didn't I exercise any of those alternatives knowing that my friend is chronically late? And I began to develop a little hypothesis, at least a partial belief that at least is plausible, if not necessarily based on fact. Do you have any idea why I might have done this stupid thing, knowing my friend was late, and not made use of the alternatives available to me?
Well,
Don?
to prove your rightness about your friend being late.
You don't do that, do you? You don't set your friends up so you can play a little one-upsmanship, do you, Don? Huh? We don't do that, things like that. So you could vent a little righteous rage and show that you're on time and your friend isn't, and you know your friend better than he knows himself. That's plausible. So I at least put that up there as a candidate. I start saying, wait a minute, I had a bunch of alternatives. I know he's always late. I didn't exercise. I could exercise those in the future. And those become rational beliefs, because I think you'll discover if you apply the 5 criteria, they don't only meet 3, they meet all 5 criteria. In any case, even though that's a hypothesis, it's a plausible hypothesis. There must be some reason I set this thing up knowing my friend is always late. Maybe it was a test of our friendship. Maybe I'm testing him to see if he really values the friendship. And well, that's a pretty stupid thing to do.
Maybe you were hoping to change him.
Maybe I was hoping to change him, and I didn't. Well, is that a source of anger for me at my friend? Maybe anger at me for me, but certainly not anger by me at my friend. If this was a halting and inadequate attempt on my part to influence my friend to change his patterns of behavior. Now, do you see if you write you may not believe those yet. That's not the point. You begin to write those down as alternative beliefs, and if they got triggered by this event in the future, instead of saying, I have a right to be angry, good heavens, he's doing this on purpose, I say, hey, stupid, you had a whole series of alternatives. You didn't exercise. I don't have any right to be angry at anybody, except me, maybe. So you begin to create these new beliefs. Now you have an alternative program. It's not in your head yet, but you have an alternative program, complete with activating event that has been camera checked, a new set of beliefs, a new set of emotions, and a new set of behaviors. And again, most of this comes in this sort of triangular fashion. Installation. And again, this is where I have to give so much credit to Maltzby. An awful lot of what Maltzby's doing is again based on Albert Ellis's cognitive emotive theory. But it is his own original design. What I really find intriguing is well before the brain research was out, Maxey, a left brain dominant, if ever there was one, just like me, an academic, a psychiatrist, realized very early on that simply saying that to yourself doesn't do any good. That's a left brain activity. Again, he didn't have that language back then, but with enough experimentation, he found just taking people through this process and these criteria and writing this stuff out, again, all left brain, didn't make any difference. So he began to systematically experiment with this issue of implementation. How do we put an override program in our heads successfully? And through lots of trial and error, he figured out what it is you have to do if you want this to go in a relatively short, painless, effective, safe way. The first thing Maltzby discovered, and again, this was well before what's called the relaxation response. Anybody read that book by Dr. Benson? It was a bestseller many years ago. He was up at Harvard, and he began to look at physiological relaxation. He took a lot of people from transcendental meditation, very popular thing, imported from India and so on, and he said, what happens to these people? I mean, what really happens inside them? And what he discovered was not only does, heartbeat and respiration and blood pressure goes down, but brain states change. You know about the various brain states that your brain can begin when you're asleep, when you're awake, when you're tense. And that indeed, when people went into deep relaxation through, for example, transcendental meditation, they go into a brain state that is incredibly receptive to new information. And so one of the things Maltzby piggybacked on when he read this literature was, if somebody's going to install an override program, if they could trigger this relaxation response, this suggestibility, this openness to new information before they rehearse the new program, it's going to go in a whole lot quicker. And he did a lot of research and discovered, yeah, the people he taught the relaxation response to, and he has his own tapes and so on, created a new, very firmly rooted override program more quickly than the people who didn't. They both did, but the people who did the relaxation response. So one of the things I'll mention toward the end here is how you might go about relearning the relaxation response so that when you go to install a new override program, every time you rehearse it, you can trigger the relaxation response first and make your mind more open to the information going in. This is being used, by the way, in learning theory right now. They're beginning to discover that little babies and infants have this enormous capacity for learning. Part of the reason is the plasticity of the brain, but there's some speculation that infants have this uncanny natural ability to be totally relaxed and focused on whatever it is they're doing. And that ability to be focused and totally relaxed allows it to come pouring in. We can't help but learn. And when we're very small, we are learning machines. You will never again in your life learn as effectively as you did between birth and age 3. Or as I am fond of saying, children learn effortlessly till we put them in schools. Okay? So you want to be able to trigger the relaxation response several times a day. We know that programs get into our brains by hardwiring, learning through repetition, and significant emotional events. The one that I have focused on and Maltzby has certainly focused on is put the new override program in by relaxation and then rehearsal, repetition. Again, there are other systems out there that rely on other ways of putting override programs in, and there are some who've experimented with a significant emotional event. I'm simply not as attuned to that and not as comfortable with it yet, and therefore am recommending the somewhat duller, but so far, I think more powerful device of repetition. What are you going to repeat in your mind after you've triggered the relaxation response? First, and again, this is right brain, isn't it? Huh? Imagine, picture, visualize the activating event in its camera-checked form. So what am I going to picture? My friend's not where he's supposed to be on time. Okay? That would be the activating event. So I picture this stimulus, the activating event. Then what do? I repeat the rational beliefs to myself. Hey, I had all kinds of alternatives here. I didn't exercise them. Okay. I have no right to be angry about anything. I still have some I can exercise. Leave the ticket for my friend. Leave a note for my friend. There's no reason to be angry about this. I rehearse the preferred emotions. You say, rehearse your emotions? What do you mean? You are experts at rehearsing your emotions. You do it every day of your life. The problem in this culture at this point in time is you and I have been taught to rehearse which emotions more often, the negative or the positive? The negative. We rehearse the hurt. We anticipate the hurt. We experience the hurt. We relive the hurt. No. If you want to be calm or you want to be empathetic or whatever it is you want to be, you picture the activating event, your friend showing up late again. You rehearse the new beliefs about his lateness in your imagination. You rehearse feeling, you see yourself and feel yourself feeling the way you want to feel when your friend shows up late, assuming you haven't taken any of the precautionary measures. And then again, you picture yourself engaging in the preferred behaviors. You see how this is a nice blend of left brain, right brain? Some of it is belief and self-talk, some of it is picturing and imagination, some of it is emotional rehearsal. Now Maltzby says if you do that twice a day, in 2 cycles of at least 5 minutes and no more than 10 minutes, as many times as you can, but don't hurry. So in the morning, maybe you give yourself from 6 to 6:10, and you wake up and you trigger the relaxation response, which you can learn. You picture the camera-checked activating event. You see and hear yourself saying the rational beliefs to yourself while picturing the activating event. You imagine and rehearse the feelings of the preferred emotions you want to have. You see yourself engaged in the preferred behaviors. You do that twice a day in these cycles. Within 2 weeks, through that imaginative rehearsal, the new program will take over. He said, you don't have to believe it. This isn't, auto-suggestion. It will happen. He's had skeptics, cynics. He said, just do it. He has had patients come to him who will not tell him the presenting problem. They won't tell him what it is that bothers them, what the negative emotion is, what the objectionable behavior. He says, I don't need to know. Just do this. And in 2 and 3 sessions, he has had suicidal people, deeply anxious people, over a period of a couple of weeks. I couldn't believe it. You mean I can train my brain to feel the way I want to feel and do what I want to do? To think the way I want it to think? He said, yeah. Just do this. And he's been doing it for over 25 years. It's absolutely amazing. Now there's a downside and an upside to this. The downside I've already mentioned. Because this is an override process, is the old program still in your brain? Yeah. And we now know, and again Maxie Maltzby points this out, if you get highly fatigued, highly emotional, under the influence of alcohol or other drugs and the activating event hits, sometimes it short circuits to the old response. The old response is still in your brain, particularly if it's been put in by hundreds, if not thousands of repetitions. He said, relax, it'll happen from time to time. Try not to get fatigued, try not to get highly emotional or under the influence of alcohol or other drugs. And the more rehearsals you do, the less likely the old program will play. But it is there and it can, and it's happened to me and it's happened to the people I've taught this to. The upside is quite remarkable. You might say to yourself, well, gee whiz, there are all sorts of things out there that make me angry, that bother me, that do this, to do that, to do the other thing. Do I have to take each one of those, do it for that, draw up the alternative program, and then rehearse that for 2 weeks? I don't have enough weeks left in my life for that one. But what must be discovered, and it's just wonderful, is the capacity of the brain for generalization. Once you have located a new destination in your brain, some beliefs about people and about the world, some calmness or empathy, some constructive behaviors, guess what the brain starts to do with new stimuli? It starts to send them in a new location, even though you haven't practiced it. And the more of these things you do, the more the brain and its intricacies begins to synergize what you're doing, and your fear index goes down if you work on one or two fears. But the whole fear index goes down. You work on a couple of anger response, the whole anger index goes down in you. You just don't get as angry as you used to about all kinds of things. When you think about it, it's not all that amazing. What happens when you encounter a new situation that you've never encountered before? What's the brain have to do?
Figure it out.
Figure out where to dump it. And where do pessimists dump the data fragments? Oh, that's awful. It's going to be a disaster. And where do the optimists dump it? Wherever the neural pathway is best worn. And hey, this looks like an opportunity to me. So it becomes generalized inside your head. Doesn't sound as though it's overwhelming, does it? Doesn't sound as though it's difficult. Certainly it's safe. You say, what if I program something in and then find out it wasn't the right one? Override it. Not a big deal. Safe, effective, efficient, painless. Almost. Oops, there's a hook. I already told you the hook. What's the hook? You start, it'll change your behavior, yeah.
People
No more
around
rationalization.
People around you are used to you
That's right.
being a particular way.
I'll never forget a board I was on one time. And another woman whom I didn't know on the board, didn't know her before the board, was a clinical psychologist. And I was talking to her about this, and I was talking about doing this with young people and in schools and so on and so forth. And she said, well, what are you really after? And I said, well, what I'm really after is strong young adults, responsible, caring, committed, contributing young adults. And she said, oh, assertive, right? I said, well, no, that's not quite what I mean. Assertiveness may be a part of it. And then she said, what are you talking about? And I went through this, and I said, you can teach young people they can design themselves, that they don't have to have a bunch of buttons that they wear on their chest that other people can push. And I began to talk about how people could really be strong, how they could be self-designed. That doesn't mean they're impersonal. It doesn't mean that they're Mr. Spock from Star Trek and have no emotions or have them under control. I would imagine most people doing this would still hold on to a lot of hurtful emotions. I want to have compassion. I want to have grief. I don't think I'd be a human being without it. That hurts, but doggone it, I don't want to override that. And as I got more, I guess, animated in my description and my enthusiasm for this notion of self-design, I could, in fact, watch the anger well up within her. And then finally, we were sitting across the table from one another before the meeting began, and I will never forget this scene. Finally, she stood up, pointed at me with her finger shaking, and she said, that means you won't let me touch you emotionally in certain ways. I said, you got it. But we're talking about the social effect. This is very threatening to some people. People who need to control other people's responses, people who need to touch your fear button, people who have to know where your insecurities are, people who have to have a sense of themselves that they can control the emotional experiences and the quality of other people's lives. Yeah, it's very threatening to those people. But even at a less significant level, it will be threatening to others simply because it's a change in you, and the old moves they made just don't work the same way they used to. And again, you're doing things like rejecting their attempts to help you rationalize. Extraordinarily powerful stuff. Now let me sort of wax macro here for a few minutes. I hypothesize, for example, that much of the hatred and intolerance, much of the prejudice in the world is taught and accepted very quickly by children, for example, because it's a cheap route to self-esteem. It protects those terribly vulnerable, easily bruised egos. That much of the conflict in the world is about bitterness and jealousies, all taught to people. Just imagine for a moment if very significant portions of populations got into self-design and learned these things about themselves and discovered they were taught to feel these ways and to behave these ways, and they don't really want to, but they didn't know what to do about it. And they start getting rid of their fears and their inferiorities and their insecurities and their hatreds and their intolerances and their prejudices. Maybe we could make some progress from inside people's heads, not from government policies, for crying out loud, that are almost all designed to make people more dependent, more afraid, more fragile. But individual human beings in their own heads decided, yeah, I don't have to hate her. I don't have to fear him. I don't have to despise her. I don't have to put her down. I don't have to think I'm better than him, not to feel good about myself. These cheap shots at security, these cheap shots at self-esteem. Maybe then we'd have a chance with that substitute for self-esteem called drugs, narcotics. Maybe we wouldn't have all these social institutions where the people are basically using the resources to take care of what's important to them and almost nothing leaks down to the client base. Maybe crime wouldn't be as attractive an alternative to service one's values if you could go in and design yourself. I don't know. I mean, it's a kind of a speculation. But I've been so frustrated in seeing what doesn't work in the world. And all of the rhetoric about we're going to reform this and we're going to change that and we're going to make the quality of your life better. You don't have to do a thing. You can still wander the earth with all the garbage programs that we're putting in your head, but we're going to make your life better out there for you. Well, we don't have to go to the macro level, do we? We can go inside of ourselves and say, hey, whatever anybody else on the face of the earth does, I can decide how I think, how I feel, and how I behave. And the quicker you get started, the better off you're going to be. You're not doing this for me. You're not doing this for the organization. You're doing this for you. But the benefits that will probably accrue to those around you, for the most part, will be monumental. So perhaps now you have some sense of why I'm so excited about this idea and why I think it's so potentially important, revolutionary, world-shattering, as we get rid of our parochial senses and our divisions and our lines and our hatreds and all the things that we use as defense mechanisms to protect against all the garbage that's been put into our brains. Perhaps one way to make this point again is to look at a scene from a very famous movie, one of the most famous movies in this country of all time. It's A Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart. Certainly gets shown hundreds of times every Christmas and often throughout the rest of the year as well. And if you know the film at all, you remember it's kind of a fantasy. It starts out with heavenly creatures up there deciding whether a not very competent angel is going to be sent down to help Jimmy Stewart. And he has this accident and, does he really see everything or is it a dream or whatever else? But he's despondent, he's depressed, the whole world's going against him now. They've lost the key deposit for his father's savings and loan that he took over, and is life worth living? And there he is standing on the bridge wondering whether he ought to commit suicide or not. But then all of this goes on in his head, and he has not a series of dull, boring repetitions, but a significant emotional event, He's shown what the world would be like, his town would be like, had it not been for his presence there, his family, his wife, the other people in the community. And so he has a whole new perception. He has a whole new series of neurological pathways in his brain. And indeed he does live again, but with a whole new perspective of who he is and what life is all about. Again, in my language, because there's been a transformation in his brain in terms of the significance of what's going on, the significance of his life. Well, maybe we're not going to have Clarence the Friendly Angel come down from heaven to install new override programs in our brains or give us significant emotional events. But even without Clarence, we now know how to go into our own brains and produce the thoughts, the feelings, and the patterns of behavior that we conclude will better serve our values and improve the quality of our life. Thank you.